A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't saying nothin'. Just don't send me back. The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a sound Silas Blackwood knew better than any human voice, a constant companion that scoured the land and the soul with equal indifference. His homestead was a lonely scar on the vast, dusty canvas of the territory, a place where silence was broken only by the creak of floorboards or the distant howl of a coyote. He chopped wood deep into the night, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar penance. Each swing was deliberate, a physical act meant to exhaust the thoughts that haunted the quiet hours, memories of a different life, a different silence filled with absence. His shoulders were weary, not just from the labor, but from the weight of years spent enduring. He didn't live here. He existed, a man whittled down to routine and remorse. He didn't know it yet, but the first true home he would ever know was rattling towards him in a dusty stagecoach, a fragile hope disguised as a mistake. The sound of wheels and straining horses was an intrusion, a metal clinking on tin that set his teeth on edge. He froze, axe in hand, watching the shape resolve itself from the smoky haze of the slate evening sky. A stagecoach had no business on this dead-end track. His track. He watched as the driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of dust and exhaustion, climbed down and consulted a crumpled scroll. The man's confusion was plain even from a distance. Silas remained where he was, a statue carved from rock and regret, as a woman was helped down. She was worn down, her dress the color of the dirt beneath her feet, and she clutched the hand of a small, pale girl who hid behind her skirts. They looked like ghosts blown in by the unforgiving wind. The driver gestured vaguely toward Silas's cabin, then toward the darkening horizon. An argument, brief and one-sided, seemed to take place. The woman's posture was rigid, a portrait of concealed fear. The driver, defeated, unstrapped a single battered trunk, dropped it in the dust, and climbed back onto his seat. He didn't look back. The coach turned and lumbered away, its departure leaving a profound and terrible quiet in its wake. The woman and child stood alone in the growing twilight, stranded. Silas finally lowered his axe. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He just watched them, his tired eyes taking in the woman who flinched at his gaze and the little girl who peered out from behind her mother's legs, her expression not of fear, but of a strange, solemn curiosity. He saw the way the wind stung her skin, a physical reflection of the coldness that had lived inside him for years. This was not his concern. It was a mistake. They would be gone by morning. He had intended for them to sleep in the barn. It was dry and out of the wind, more than many had. He gestured toward it with a curt nod, his face a mask of stone. The woman, whose name he did not know and did not wish to know, simply nodded back, her eyes fixed on the ground. She was exhausted, a living monument to suffering, and she herded her daughter toward the rough-hewn wooden door without a word of protest. He went inside his cabin, the familiar scent of wood smoke and solitude wrapping around him. He stoked the fire in the stove, the scrape of metal on metal grating in the quiet. But the silence was different now. It was shared. He could feel their presence across the yard, a weight in the air he hadn't consented to. He ate his meal of beans and hard bread standing by the counter, his gaze drifting to the single window that faced the barn. A pale sliver of light from his smoky lamp fell across the dust outside. He thought of the biting wind, the way the temperature dropped like a stone once the dusty sun vanished. He remembered another night, another chill that had crept into his bones and never left. A memory flickered, a small hand in his, a feverish brow. He swallowed, the food tasting like ash in his mouth. He put his tin cup down with a sharp clink. This was not his problem. He repeated it to himself, a litany against the unfamiliar stirring in his chest. But the image of the little girl's thin coat persisted. The sight of the woman's shoulders, trembling but unbowed, remained. He had built this isolation to protect himself, a fortress of quiet dignity against a world that had taken everything. And now, the world had arrived on his doorstep, helpless and unobtrusive. He paced the small room, his footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. The solitude he had cultivated felt suddenly hollow, a cold comfort against the raw, living need just a few yards away. He was a man who acted, not a man who felt. His core action for years had been to endure. But as he stood there, listening to the wind that seemed to mourn with him, he knew he couldn't leave them out there. It was an impulsive act, born of a remorse he could not name. He opened the cabin door, letting the frosty air rush in, and walked toward the barn. He found them huddled together on a pile of hay, a single thin blanket pulled up to their chins. The woman's eyes snapped open, wide with alarm. The little girl, however, simply watched him. He didn't speak. He jerked his head toward the cabin. "You can take the cot," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She stared, her expression unreadable. He turned and walked away before she could answer. He did not see the first unsteady tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. He did not hear the little girl whisper to her mother, her voice a fragile thread of sound, "Is he an angel, Mama?" Her name was Alara. The child's was Lily. He learned this not because they spoke it, but because he found a worn-out primer in their trunk when he moved it inside. The names felt alien in his silent world. For 3 days they existed in a state of rigid separation, sharing his roof but not his life. She was a ghost in his home, moving with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. She rose before him, the smell of coffee a strange and unwelcome comfort in the morning air. She cleaned with a fierce, desperate energy, as if trying to scrub away her own unwelcome presence. She patched his worn shirts with thread she'd unraveled from her own hem, her stitches small and perfect. She asked for nothing. She said nothing. Her silence was a mirror to his own, but where his was born of grief, hers was clearly forged in fear. She flinched if he moved too quickly, her hands instinctively going to her daughter, who was a smaller, more watchful shadow of her mother. Lily, however, was different. She watched him with eyes that seemed too old for her small face, a calm and considering gaze that made him uneasy. He would catch her staring as he mended a harness or sharpened a blade, her expression one of deep contemplation. He felt her gaze like a physical touch, probing the layers of guilt he kept packed around his heart. He tried to ignore her, to retreat into the numbness that had served him so well. He took his meals on the porch, even as the air grew colder, putting a deliberate distance between them. It was a consequence of his impulsive act, this invasion of his sanctuary. He had acted against his nature, and now he was trapped. He did not know how to fix it. He did not know how to send them away. The man from the stagecoach never returned. One afternoon, he came back from checking his trap lines to find a small, crudely drawn picture of a flower left on his workbench. He knew it was from the girl. He looked at it for a long time, the unsteady lines a stark contrast to the harsh, practical shapes of his tools. He felt a raw, suppressed emotion rise in his throat and quickly crushed it. He swept the drawing into the fire. He was not a man who accepted gifts. He was a man who paid his debts, and he still didn't know what this one was costing him. That evening, as Alara served him his stew, her hand trembled. She had seen him burn the drawing. Her eyes were downcast, but he could feel her hurt, a palpable thing in the small, lamplit room. She misunderstood. He hadn't done it out of cruelty. He had done it out of a desperate need to maintain the wall he'd built around himself, a wall that was beginning to crack. He remained silent. Then, gruffly, he said, "The stew is good," she nodded, not looking at him. But something in her rigid posture softened, just a fraction. It was the longest conversation they'd had. She stayed. The change was gradual, a slow thaw after a long winter. It began not with words, but with small, secret interventions. He noticed Lily's shoes were worn through, the soles thin enough to feel the cold earth. One night, after Alara and the girl were asleep on their cot behind a blanket he'd hung for privacy, he took the shoes to his workbench. Under the smoky lamp, his large, calloused hands worked with surprising deftness, cutting new soles from a piece of scrap leather and carefully stitching them into place. It was honest, deliberate work, He left the repaired shoes by the door, where she would find them in the morning. He was outside before she woke, but he imagined her surprise, her cautious gratitude. He didn't want thanks. He wanted the uneasy debt he felt to be settled. A few days later, he returned from the wilderness to find a stack of freshly chopped kindling by the stove, far more than he needed for the evening. It was her quiet reply, a gesture that spoke of a shared burden. He began leaving an extra piece of jerky or a dried apple from his stores on the table. She began mending his things with an unobtrusive thoroughness that left them stronger than before. They were building a language without a single spoken word, a vocabulary of cautious care. The catalyst for this fragile reconnection was the child. Lily was not bound by the same fear as her mother or the same guilt as Silas. One afternoon, she approached him while he was carving a piece of wood, something he did to keep his hands busy. She didn't speak, just watched, her chin barely reaching the height of his workbench. He ignored her, the knife moving in smooth, practiced strokes. Finally, she pointed a small finger at the wood. "For a bird," she whispered. He grunted, not looking at her. He was carving a handle for a shovel. But the next day he found himself selecting a small piece of soft pine. He worked on it when they were asleep, the shape of a small sparrow slowly emerging from the block. He sanded it smooth, its tiny form fitting perfectly in his palm. He left it on the windowsill, just as she had left her drawing. The next morning, he watched from the corner of his eye as she discovered it. A slow, wondrous smile spread across her face. She cradled the wooden bird in her hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. For the first time, he heard her laugh, a sound like tiny bells in the oppressive silence of the cabin. It struck a chord deep inside him, a note that hadn't been played in years. He turned away, his throat tight. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. A home built not of wood and stone, but of mended shoes and a small, carved bird. The storm came without warning, a furious onslaught of wind and snow that turned the world into a churning vortex of white. It was a true blizzard, the kind that sealed you in a tomb of ice and silence. The biting wind howled, rattling the wooden door of the cabin and finding every tiny crack in the walls. For 2 days, they were prisoners. The three of them crowded into the small space, the vast wilderness outside erased by the deep fog of snow. The routine of their lives was broken. There was no work to be done outside, only the constant, pressing need to feed the stove and keep the killing cold at bay. The enforced proximity was a heavy blanket, suffocating the fragile peace they had built. Silas felt caged, the walls of his carefully constructed solitude closing in. Alara was tense, her movements jerky and uncertain. But it was Lily who broke open the dam of their restraint. On the second night, a cough started deep in her chest, a dry, racking sound that echoed the harshness of the wind outside. By morning, her face was flushed with fever, and her breath came in shallow, unsteady gasps. Alara crouched by the cot, her face a mask of raw terror. She bathed the child's forehead with a damp rag, her touch gentle but her hands trembling. She looked at Silas, her eyes pleading for something she could not bring herself to ask for. He saw the same fear he remembered seeing in the mirror years ago. The memory was a physical blow. He froze for only a moment. Then, the numbness receded, replaced by a clear, sharp sense of purpose. He remembered the old remedies his wife, Sarah, had sworn by. He moved with a quiet, reliable certainty, crushing herbs for a poultice and brewing a bitter tea. Alara watched him, her suspicion warring with a growing, desperate hope. He showed her how to mix the herbs with hot water, his large hands guiding her small ones. For the first time, they touched, a brief, functional contact that sent a jolt through them both. They worked together through the long night, a silent, unified team. He kept the stove roaring, melting snow for water. She held Lily, whispering soft reassurances, her voice a low, calming murmur. At one point, as he crouched beside the cot to listen to the child's breathing, Lily's small hand reached out and took his. Her skin was hot and dry. She looked at him with fever-bright eyes. "God finally sent you to us," she whispered, her voice a sleepy rasp. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. He didn't pull his hand away. He just knelt there, in the dim, smoky lamplight, feeling the small, trusting weight of her fingers in his, and felt the cracking ice around his own heart begin to splinter and give way. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white under a pale winter sun. Lily's fever had broken with it, her breathing now soft and even. The crisis had passed, but something had fundamentally shifted in the small cabin. The rigid lines of separation had blurred. A fragile trust had taken root in the frozen earth of their shared ordeal. When they finally ran low on flour and salt, a trip to the nearest town, Blackwater, became unavoidable. Silas hitched the horse to the sleigh, the air so cold it felt like breathing powdered glass. The journey was silent, but it was a comfortable silence now, a shared space rather than an empty one. Alara sat beside him, Lily bundled in a blanket between them, clutching her wooden bird. The town was a shock of noise and people after weeks of isolation. As Silas tied up the horse, a man stepped out of the general store, a broad-shouldered figure whose solid presence radiated a harsh authority. It was Jedediah Kane, the man who owned the massive ranch to the north, the man, Silas now realized, who this mail-order bride must have originally been for. Kane's eyes landed on Alara, and a slow, cruel smirk spread across his weathered face. "Well, look what the storm blew in," he boomed, his voice carrying across the street. "Thought you'd been eaten by wolves. Found a new master, have you?" The townsfolk nearby stopped and turned to watch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Alara flinched as if struck. She lowered her gaze, her face pale, and pulled Lily tighter against her. The child clung to her, sensing the threat. "Hope he's paying you more than the nothing you're worth," Kane continued, enjoying his audience. "I ordered a sturdy worker, not a worn-down charity case." With a whelp, laughter rippled through the small crowd. It was a moment of profound, public humiliation. Alara seemed to shrink, her quiet dignity shattering under the weight of his scorn. Silas had been watching, his expression unreadable. For a moment he did nothing, the old impulse to retreat, to remain silent, warring with the new, protective instinct that had been growing inside him. He looked at Alara's trembling shoulders, at Lily's frightened face. He thought of her hand in his during the storm. He stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply placed himself between Kane and Alara, a solid, unmovable presence. His voice was low, but it cut through the cold air with the sharp edge of steel. "She's with me," Kane scoffed. "Couldn't afford a proper woman, Blackwood? Had to take my table scraps." Silas looked directly at him, his eyes like chips of slate. "Not bought," he said, the words clear and deliberate. "Chosen." He put a steadying hand on Alara's shoulder. The crowd fell silent. The word hung in the frosty air, powerful and undeniable. Kane's face darkened, but he saw the look in Silas's eyes and knew he had lost. He turned and stalked away. Alara looked up at Silas, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him with fear or suspicion, but with a raw, trembling gratitude. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her. He had given her back her name. She cried. He stayed. That evening, the world seemed to hold its breath. A deep fog rolled in, blanketing the homestead in a soft, gray quiet. The lamp cast a warm, golden circle in the cabin, a haven against the encroaching darkness. They sat on the small porch, the cold air sharp on their faces, the silence between them no longer a void but a space full of unspoken things. The wind whispered through the dry grass, a sound that was now more a sigh than a threat. It was Alara who finally spoke, her voice so soft it was almost part of the wind. "Why?" It was the same question she had asked with her eyes in town, the question that had hung between them since the day she arrived. She deserved an answer. He didn't look at her. Instead, his gaze went to the small, fenced-off patch of earth on the hill, barely visible in the slate evening sky. A single weathered stone marked the place. "My Sarah," he began, his voice a low, rusty thing. "And our boy, Thomas," He spoke of a fever, much like Lily's, that had come in the deep of winter 5 years past. He told her of his helplessness, of the silence that had descended on the cabin after they were gone, a silence so complete it had almost consumed him. He spoke of the guilt, a bitter companion that had stalked him every day since, the feeling that he should have done more, been more. "I came out here to disappear," he admitted, the words tasting strange and foreign. To let the silence take what was left, he fell quiet, having said more than he had in years. He had shown her the raw, concealed wound he carried. He waited for her to retreat, to be repelled by the depth of his brokenness. Instead, she spoke of her own past, a story told in soft, broken pieces. A husband lost to a mine collapse, a life of unrelenting hardship, the desperate choice to become a mail-order bride for her daughter's sake, only to be sent to the wrong ranch and rejected. She spoke of the constant fear, the feeling of being an object to be measured and discarded. As she talked, her hand, small and warm, came to rest on his arm. It was not a gesture of pity, but of understanding. A simple, solid touch that said, "I see your pain. You are not alone." He looked down at her hand on his weathered sleeve. In that moment, a profound realization settled over him. They were two separate solitudes that had, by some strange twist of fate, found a way to merge. They were not defined by the people they had lost or the hardships they had endured. They were defined by the fact that they were still here, sitting together on this porch, breathing in the cold night air. They were survivors. They were strong together. The future was an unknown territory, as vast and intimidating as the plain that stretched out before them. But for the first time in a very long time, Silas did not feel like he had to face it alone. Her hand on his arm was an anchor in the storm. Winter finally released its icy grip, and the land began to breathe again. The passing of the seasons marked a change not just in the environment, but within the walls of the small cabin. The homestead, once a place of solitary penance, slowly transformed into a place of shared life. Spring arrived in hesitant strokes of green across the dusty brown earth. Silas plowed a small patch of land near the cabin for a garden, the shovel turning the soil he had once seen only as a final resting place. Alara, her movements no longer tinged with the rigid apprehension of a guest, worked beside him, planting seeds with a deliberate, hopeful care. Laughter, small and fragile at first, began to fill the air. It was usually sparked by Lily, who now chattered freely. Her world expanded beyond the confines of her mother's skirts. She followed Silas as he did his chores, asking endless questions he found himself answering with a gruff patience. He taught her how to identify bird calls and how to whittle a stick into a sharp point. She, in turn, left him gifts of colorful rocks and wildflowers on his workbench. He no longer threw them away. The home thrived under their combined efforts. The daily rhythm was no longer one of silent, separate tasks, but a partnership. He would repair the fence, and she would have a warm meal waiting. She would wash the clothes, and he would have a fire roaring to dry them. They moved around each other with an easy, unspoken understanding, their shared purpose weaving their lives together. One evening, as the dusty sun bled across the horizon, he watched her from the porch. She was sitting in the doorway, brushing Lily's hair, humming a soft, gentle tune. The light caught in her hair, and for the first time, he saw not the exhausted survivor who had arrived on his doorstep, but a woman of quiet, resilient beauty. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead and buried. It was a slow, growing tenderness that felt more real and solid than the fierce, youthful passion he remembered. This was different. This was a love grown in the hard soil of shared sorrow and mutual respect. This was a true home, a sanctuary built by two broken people who had found a way to heal each other. The silence was still there, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with peace. He didn't know it then, standing on that dusty plain watching the stagecoach arrive, but he was a man waiting for a reason. He thought he was guarding a grave, but he was guarding an empty space that only a family could fill. He had built his world out of the sturdy materials of guilt and solitude, believing them to be strong enough to last a lifetime. But he had not accounted for the persistent, quiet strength of a woman's dignity, or the simple, disarming truth in a child's whisper. Love does not always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it seeps in slowly, like rain into parched earth, a gradual softening of what has grown hard and barren. It grows in the spaces between words, in the shared labor of a long day, in the silent understanding that passes between two people who have seen the worst of the world and have chosen to face it together. It is found in a pair of mended shoes left by a door, in a cup of hot coffee on a cold morning, in the protective step that places a body between a loved one and a cruel word. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. True strength isn't the ability to endure pain alone. It's the courage to let someone else see your scars and to not be afraid of theirs. It is the quiet realization that the shelter you have built for yourself is only a real home when you open the door and let someone else in. He had offered her shelter from a storm, and in return, she had given him back his life. It was a trade he had never intended to make, a salvation he never believed he deserved. Love grows where no one looks, in the forgotten corners of the world, nurtured by small gestures of unassuming kindness. It is the most resilient thing on this earth. The final piece of the home clicked into place on a warm summer evening. For weeks, Silas had spent his evenings on the porch, working on a special project. He had carefully selected a piece of smooth, strong oak, and with the same deliberate care he applied to all things, he had crafted a small rocking chair. It was sized perfectly for Lily, its lines simple and honest, its surface sanded until it felt like silk. He brought it inside and set it by the stove without a word. Lily's gasp of delight was his reward. She immediately climbed in, her small feet pushing off the floorboards, a look of pure joy on her face. Alara watched him, her eyes soft and full of a deep, abiding affection. He had not just built a piece of furniture. He had carved a permanent place for her child in his life, in his home. Later, as dusk settled, he stood by the open window, looking out at the land that was no longer a place of exile but a place of promise. The air was warm, carrying the scent of blooming prairie flowers. Alara came to stand beside him. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The question of their future had been a silent, patient guest in their home for months. It was time to give it a voice. He turned to her, his heart, which he had once thought a dead and useless thing, beating a steady, reliable rhythm in his chest. He did not have the words for poetry or grand declarations. His language was one of simple, solid truths. "Stay here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. It was a promise. She looked up at him, her answer in the gentle smile that touched her lips and the light that shone in her eyes. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We're home," she whispered. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that even in the most desolate of places, and in the most silent of hearts, kindness can take root and blossom into something extraordinary. True connection is often built not on grand pronouncements, but on the quiet, steady gestures of care and protection. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. Was it the moment he chose her in town, or the quiet confession on the porch? We'll see you again, where silence means home.